So what I'm going to do here is just show you selected works from the second half of the 20th century. Some of these are selected because I have images of them. By the 1960s, some artists wanted to return to realistic images. They wanted to get away from non-representational art. And there was a group known as the pop artists because they took their images from commercial art and from popular culture. And they were very prominent during the 1960s. One of the most famous, of course, is Andy Warhol. And he was kind of a phenomena in and of himself. But he often would do these silk-screened images. He was using a commercial method of creating the images. And a lot of repetition of the form. So here we see the Marilyn Diptych, in which you see the repeated image of Marilyn Monroe, just row on row, and that they're subtly different. Some of them have more shading than others. And then on the second half, there's no color. The figures are becoming smeared, fainter and fainter. She's fading away, quite literally. That may take on even additional meaning when you compare it to some of his other work. He was famous for doing pictures of things like Brillo soap boxes and giant soup cans, or in this case, that repetition of rows and rows of 200 Campbell soup cans. So, this is a commercial commodity made in mass production, something people see every day, and so he's, putting it up there. But you can see it's laid out very similarly to Marilyn Monroe's picture. So we have rows after rows. And, certainly this suggests to us immediately that, the woman is being made into a commercial product. And she's being repeated, and maybe the real person is fading away. There's all sorts of associations you can make with this and suggested meanings. And of course, Warhol denied any meaning in them. And of course, Andy Warhol denied that there was any meaning in these. And yet, we as human beings need to find meaning. The sculptor from pop art was Claes Oldenburg. And I thought I'd tell you a few of the things that I've seen. I remember one time I was in Philadelphia waiting for a bus, which never came because unbeknownst to me, they had canceled buses on that day. And I'm standing there waiting, and all of a sudden I look up. I was standing next to the Oldenburg clothespin, which essentially is this giant clothespin, the kind that have springs in them. And when I looked up and I said, oh my goodness, I had no idea that clothespins were that graceful. So sometimes he'll just take a common, ordinary object, he's famous for giant hamburgers, for example, and put it out there in much larger as a work of art. Sometimes he'll take art, sometimes he will take the object and change it in certain ways. For example, 1970, I happened into an exhibition of Oldenburg in the Tate Museum in London, and he had created a band, essentially the musical instruments, with all of these soft, sagging drums. In other words, something that has to be taut in order to work, but there they were, just in amorphous shapes, sagging on a little platform. And he would do that. At that point, he was doing all these soft sculptures of things that normally were hard, like a typewriter, and create them into some kind of stuffed, sagging image. Okay, this is the Yale lipstick. It's known as lipstick ascending on caterpillar tracks, which is pretty descriptive. You have a image that looks like a lipstick, but it also looks like a missile rising out of this square base, and then the caterpillar tracks remind us immediately of a tank. So it looks like some kind of military equipment, like a missile that's going to be fired at someone. This was, of course, during the period of the Vietnam War, and this was seen as a protest against the Vietnam War, and as such became very controversial. It also has, I guess you could say, some puns from the language. We see the lipstick, and we associate that with the, somebody trying to make themselves look beautiful and perhaps erotic. And so it suggests things like, make love, not war, or putting on your war paint, your makeup. But there also were other artists who explored, new techniques and processes in art. One of these was Eva Hesse, who had, as you say, a very short life. She died at age 34 of a brain tumor. And she is an American artist. She was born in Germany, but she became an American. Her career was tragically very short, only 5 years before she died of a brain tumor. But during that time, she created an entirely new type of art. This is rope piece, see, from the last years of her life, 1969 to 70. And she's used latex over rope and string, and then suspends this with wire. And you can imagine that looking at it, you could have all sorts of different arrangements. And you have this, very unusual texture. And of course, you have some of the feeling of line and shape and shadow. So it is a purely abstract work. Not everybody gave up abstraction. And the emphasis is on the materials and manipulating them. It's a type of art that we call, here you can see it from, a side, the different point of view. Now, this is a type of art we call process art. It was considered to be very innovative, new type of sculpture. And what had been going on was kind of minimalism, very, very simple forms, such as like, rectangular shapes. Her art was seen as post-minimalist. It had an emphasis on the form, it had an emphasis on the technique, and often embodied a lot of concepts. It was the idea of conceptual art. Art that has something beyond the more physical. And here, of course, we're also emphasizing the process of art. There you can see, looking at different point of view. This was a type of art called process art. This is a new term, and it implies art where you're emphasizing the technique. Hesse style has also been called post-minimalism, that it stands out against minimalism, which was monolithic, sometimes architectural geometry, very simplified sculpture that maybe was just rectangular forms. And she's obviously doing something much more complex than that. So it was seen as very innovative, a totally new type of sculpture, a departure from the contemporary minimalistic art, and often seen as embodying a strong concept as well as emphasizing the technique. And it was extremely influential on later sculptors. I've mentioned several times the difficulties that women artists throughout history have had being accepted. And in the 20th century, women often had the same problems. Women were being accepted into art programs as students, But oftentimes, when they tried to find, say, a university position, they'd find that all of the professors were male. And, you know, when they tried to exhibit, it was sometimes very difficult for women to exhibit. There were those old assumptions that women weren't capable of doing creative activity, that their work was weak. And so a number of feminist artists, sometimes they banded together and tries to raise awareness of women artists. Among these, very famously, was Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro. Now, Chicago is not her actual last name. She chose the name of the city where she was born as her name, so she's known as Judy Chicago. Miriam Shapiro does a lot of art that uses fabric and fabric collages, and she's deliberately choosing a medium that is associated with women and sometimes would be looked down on because, oh yeah, that's a woman's medium, you know, sewing, something like that. But she creates fine art pieces from them, and of course, you know, now is quite well known for it. Back in the early 70s, they founded the Feminist Art Program at the California Institute for Arts. And one of their very famous projects was they had a woman-only art installation called Woman House. And they got permission to create installations in this mansion that was about to be torn down near Hollywood, California. And so each woman was given a different room in which she created her installation. So it became an installation and a performance piece. This was the time when people were doing happenings. They would combine art installations with performance. And it was only up for about a month. Probably the most famous and certainly controversial work by Judy Chicago was The Dinner Party from the 1970s. This is a large installation that takes the form of a triangular table on a tile floor. And she creates symbolic place settings for 39 notable women in history. And then on the floor are written names of, I think it's 99 additional women. Now, she deliberately chose craft media, including media that were associated with women, embroidery, china painting. She did not create every aspect of this. She had craftswomen, you know, to do some of the embroidery. And she had you know, many women who participated in this, who did embroidery and some of the other craft functions to her design. And I'm just going to show you a few of these place settings. One of the interesting things about this is it teaches you women's history. And I know when I was in school, you know, they almost never mentioned women. I would have said it was not because women weren't capable, it was because women were often legally and socially restricted to certain roles. And you know, they couldn't, with some notable exceptions, you know, take leading roles in history. And one of the things that I learned from Judy Chicago's dinner party were about women that I had never heard of before. So I learned a lot about women's history. A medieval physician, the first woman to be burnt at the stake as a witch. And even writers like Mary Wollstonecraft. We'll see her table setting shortly. This place setting is for Theodora, the 6th century Byzantine empress. She was the wife of the great lawgiver Justinian, and she had been treated very terribly by some of the people who did not like her background. Her background was a showgirl, essentially. She was a performer. She probably had been forced into prostitution as a child. And she attracted the attention of Justinian, and he married her. And she became a very powerful empress. She protected some of the Monophysites. The Monophysites were the theologians who believed that Christ was fully divine and only had the appearance of history. In the West, that was regarded as a heresy. In the East, in Byzantium, it was fairly popular. She is also the one to whom Justinian may owe his throne. During the Nike riots, Justinian was about to flee the city of Constantinople. And Theodora is supposed to have admonished him and challenged him to stay and put down the riots. And the phrase that she's supposed to have used is, "Purple makes a lovely shroud." In other words, she would rather die an empress than flee. And Justinian stayed, and of course became probably the most famous emperor in Byzantine history. So what you're seeing here is a place setting that has little sort of golden pieces that look a little bit like tesserae, because Theodora is shown in a mosaic in Ravenna, at the Church of San Vitale, with, of course, these beautiful glass tesserae, little pieces of mosaic. And you can see down there where her name is, there's this sort of vaulted shape with arches, which could refer either to the very famous Byzantine church, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, founded and raised up by the order of Justinian. Or it could refer to San Vitale in Ravenna, where her image still exists. Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen was a visionary nun. She founded several convents, and she had, visions, which some people say are prompted by migraine headaches. But what I would say is she's taken that pain and experience and transformed it into a kind of spiritual meaning. She is the only woman who has an entire volume of her writings in Patrologius Cursus Completus. That is the complete works of the fathers of the church. And here you see we have a mother of the church who just recently, as I say this, in October of 2012, was declared a doctor of the church, and very few women have been given that title. It means that the Catholic Church honors their writings as true and free from error. Judy Chicago also included some artists, Artemisia Gentileschi. And here you see what almost seems to be a very Baroque drapery with lots of embroidery and dramatic drapery folds and very colorful plate. And if you look on the floor below, you can make out the names of some of the female artists that we've had in class, and some others, of course, that we haven't. You can see a part, hyphen Lebrun from Vigée Lebrun. Or right below her is Rosa Alba Carrera. Rosa Alba Carrera was an 18th century female artist who worked in pastels. She's one of the innovators of the medium of pastels. And you can see part of Angelica Kaufmann's name. And then there you see Maria, which I assume is Maria Sibella Marian. Now, I want you to remember, it wasn't just artists she's showing here. She's using famous women, throughout history. And this is the place setting that she gives for Mary Wollstonecraft. And you can see embroidered is the name of her book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published at the end of the 18th century, 1792. She is one of the women in history that call for rights for women. And yet, I never heard of her. I was never taught women's history. And so, when I look at Judy Chicago's work here, I look at it not only artistically, but almost as a kind of educational experience. Because for women, and I would think for men too, who want to know more about history, I'm learning about people that in some cases I had never heard of before she created this work of art. And of course, she had to do a lot of research and then choose from hundreds of women who she was going to represent. Among them is Sojourner Truth. And as you can see, she's used ideas of African fabrics. And on the plate, the two heads with the African mask in the center, the more realistic face with the tear dripping down her face from the sorrows, the horrors of slavery. And then on the other side, you have the African face and the raised hand, calling for power, calling for the defeat, and the absolute eradication of slavery. Georgia O'Keeffe, a very famous woman artist, one of the innovators of more abstracted forms in the United States. And of course, she's famous for her Western landscapes, and also for these giant flowers that she does, and they take on really abstract shapes. And so I think that's the place setting is supposed to refer to the floral motif. And I should say something here. These plates are supposed to be stylized vaginas. And that is one of the things that made this so controversial. And so we'll have to discuss that. Here you can see closer in how the place settings go together. And you can make out one here that's of Hatshepsut, the 18th dynasty Egyptian pharaoh. And she was a woman who ruled in her own right. And she brought peace and prosperity to Egypt. And as one of the most famous women in history, of course. You see the hieroglyphics embroidered around her place setting. Now, as I said, this was a very controversial work of art. It was supposed to be placed in a public building in Washington, D.C., but Congress blocked it. Some of the members of Congress did not want to see this put up. One of the ostensible reasons was they thought that this is obscene to show stylized vaginas. And I have to admit, as a woman, having never seen vaginas, I had no idea until someone told me what it was supposed to be. I thought, gee, these men must know much more about, they've probably seen more than I have. But also, to me, I also felt that they were blocking it because it was women's history. And it was almost like they wanted to suppress that. At one point, I remember reading in Newsweek, George Will said that it was nothing but a collection of vaginas. And it made me angry, because to me it was saying that the entire history of women, everything they've ever done, is nothing more than a collection of vaginas, that he saw them only as sexual beings. I see that we have a lot of phallic monuments in Washington, D.C. and other places. I'll take the Washington Monument, this giant obelisk, for example. And yet I don't hear senators or congressmen denouncing it. And so I do think that it has something to do with the fact that it was female. And we found that some senators feel that naming scientific names of parts of the female body they consider obscene. Do they feel the same way about the male body? Well, I guess they'd have to answer that for themselves. At any rate, this Long was homeless. It was in boxes. And eventually, the Brooklyn Museum of Art gave it a home. And so you can go to Brooklyn and see it. And they actually have a very fine website with a lot of details, some of which I used in this presentation. Expressionism keeps popping up. It's as I said, it's not just one art movement. It's a characteristic that occurs in a number of artists' work throughout history. And so in the second half of the 20th century, there's something they call Neo-Expressionism, of which one artist is Anselm Kiefer. Kiefer is a German artist. He was born in 1945, right at the end of World War II, so he certainly was not a participant in the Nazi past of Germany. And yet, much of his work does confront the destruction from World War II and and Germany's past, including the Nazi era. He uses mixed media. He uses all of these different things together. He has oil, acrylic, shellac, burlap, straw, fibers, all sorts of things mixed into this, and they create this effect of a devastated landscape. They often have puns in German. And sort of layered meanings. This is the Heath of the Brandenburg March. It just stretches back to the landscape and has this extremely rich textural surface with, as we said, all this mixed media on burlap. And there you see he includes the use of the words with images, which a number of 20th century artists, particularly the second half of the 20th century, a number of 20th century artists use words. And the last artist I'm going to talk about is another American artist. Her name is Maya Ying Lin. And she's very famous for creating the design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Of 1982. When this was created, essentially the government wanted to put up a memorial for the Vietnam War. And they had a blind competition. In other words, the artist would send them the design, but there would be no names on the design when the jury, when the committee that juried it, picked the monument. And when it was discovered that the person who designed the winning monument was female and an undergraduate at Yale, and I think probably also that she was of Asian heritage, even though she's an American, all of that caused a great deal of controversy, as did her design. There was a tremendous amount of opposition. And indeed, there were people who thought there should be a figural monument. Because of some of this controversy, another two statues were commissioned at some distance, in the same general area, but at some distance from this monument. One was a very realistic bronze statue of soldiers. This was by the sculptor Frederick Hart, who is not to be confused with the art historian Frederick Hart. And another one then was put up to honor the women who were Vietnam veterans. These were usually nurses. And that was actually also by a woman artist, Glenau Goodacre. But what we're looking at is the winning design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Maya Ying Lin. And as you can see, it's cut into the side of the mall and forms a kind of triangular shape with a walkway that goes down beside it. It's made of polished black granite, and this means it has reflections in it. And you can see here that you have reflections from the surrounding landscape. You can see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance. And as we'll see, the viewers are reflected in the monument. It's polished black granite. It is of a minimalist design. It's just very, very simple, just these slabs of granite. On each of those slabs are listed the names of the American soldiers who were killed and missing in the Vietnam War. She'll have the year and then the names of all of the people who died that year. We always say we will never forget. But we do. In this monument, at least, the names of all of these people will be preserved as long as the monument survives. For all the controversy surrounding the awarding of the commission, this has now become perhaps the most beloved monument on the Washington Mall. And the reason is because there is such an interaction between the viewers, including the mourners, and the names of the dead veterans. People go, they see themselves reflected. They leave flowers. They look for the names of relatives or loved ones. They see themselves reflected in the granite with those, superimposed over those names. People take rubbings of the names of individual people. Maybe it's one of their relatives. Maybe it's someone that they knew, or just a memorial. And although it's not illustrated in your textbook, I wanted to show you another monument by Maya Ying Lin. This is the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. It was created a little later in the 80s, 1988 to 89. And you have, once again, the black granite with this round, it's a fountain. There's water flowing over it. And then, as you can see, the inscription on the wall beside it. This honors those who acted and those who died during the Civil Rights Movement. It starts with the Supreme Court calling for school desegregation in Brown versus Brown of 1954. And on this round slab, going around like spokes out of a wheel, it goes around, and the last one is Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination from 1968. And the theme of this is written out. Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It's biblical. That's from the Old Testament. It's biblical. It's from Amos 5:24. And Dr. Martin Luther King quoted it in his I Have a Dream speech. And those words became Lin's inspiration for the creation of the monument. It's a timeline. kind of giant circular monument. And water flows over all of these events. You know, water is flowing down and justice like a mighty stream. And people can reach out and touch the names beneath the running water. And one of the things that I read about this that was so moving was when they had the dedication. This is what Marilyn said about it. Emmett Till's mother. He was a 13-year-old boy who was murdered. Emmett Till's mother was touching his name beneath the water and crying. And I realized her tears were becoming part of the memorial. There's also this idea of earth art or earthworks in which you reshape or alter part of the earth. Sometimes they're just temporary. They're only up for a small amount of time. Other times they just leave them and the earth reclaims them. Generally the way they're known originally as they were formed is from a photographic record. And in many cases, these things are very large and they require teams of participants to realize the design of the artist. A couple of these are from the late 60s, early 70s. Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. And Christo and Jeanne-Claude, who are very famous for doing this, and we're going to see running fence in the gates. This is pretty much just what it sounds like, a spiral jetty, a spiral earthwork built out into the Great Salt Lake of Utah. And now, you know, it's going to be reclaimed by the elements. Christo and Jeanne-Claude are very famous for using these, I'm not sure if they're plastic or fabric forms. And one of them from the early 70s was running fence. And I think it was like 26 miles. It was many miles. They put up this fence that, as you can see, billows with the wind and runs over hills and forms this very graceful shape across the landscape. Of course, those are taken down. They wrapped buildings, they wrapped islands. You know, these are all temporary structures. And in 2005, they created one of these environmental structures in Central Park in New York City. And as you can see, that was winter. You had some very cold days with snow. And so they were basically a structure that holds these orange pieces of fabric and placed around Central Park so people, you know, could walk under them. And that contrasts very strongly, as you can see, from the white, gray color scheme of snow in New York. Here is a sunnier day, the snow is melted, and you can see people walking under what they call the gates, and they're, you know, the wind is blowing and the fabric is billowing. Here it is, contrasted with the snow-covered bare boughs of the trees. And one last image.